If you're thinking of starting a saltwater aquarium, there has never been a better time to do so because of the wealth of information available to demystify the hobby. But some myths still persist, largely because they're based on an element of truth. So today we're going to bust the 6 most common myths about saltwater aquariums. First up is that saltwater tanks are much harder than freshwater tanks. And of course there is an element of truth to this. If you want a full-blown reef tank filled with the most delicate corals, that is probably more difficult than keeping a few neon tetras. But a full-blown reef tank is not the saltwater equivalent of keeping guppies and tetras. At the pinnacle of freshwater, you have advanced planted tanks that can take just as much skill, time and dedication as a full-blown reef tank. And some freshwater fish like discus are just as challenging as anything you'll find on the salty side. If you just want to keep a few hardy saltwater fish and corals, it's honestly not that much harder than a simple freshwater tank. You will need to do a little more research and maintenance, but understanding a few key basics will get you 90% of the way with saltwater, and the bare statement that saltwater is much harder than freshwater is an oversimplification of the true position. Saltwater can be almost as easy as freshwater, and freshwater can be just as difficult as saltwater. Related to that is the myth that you need to try freshwater first before you go salty. Now, to be fair, it won't hurt to do so, and keeping chops will help you discover if you actually enjoy the reality of keeping fish, 90% of which is basically scraping algae and doing water changes. But with the exception of the nitrogen cycle, there are actually very few crossovers between fresh and saltwater. I spent 2 years keeping tropical fish before I went salty, but all I really learned was a little about controlling pests like algae and snails, and a little about fish aggression and compatibility. But the fix for equivalent pests in a saltwater tank is different to the fix for pests in a freshwater tank. And knowing that a single tiger barb will probably batter a guppy isn't much use in a saltwater tank. Now, understanding those sorts of issues is no harder in a reef tank, it's just different. And honestly, you'll be starting from scratch when you go salty, regardless of whether you have freshwater experience. So if graduating onto saltwater is your goal from the start, you will learn a lot more by getting stuck in than you will by practicing your badminton serve before giving tennis a try. My third saltwater aquarium myth is that you need to be able to understand the science behind the hobby. If you delve into an advanced video on reef keeping, it can sound completely overwhelming, and you'll hear explanations of what suppressed pH levels can do to the biology of a coral, and you'll see never-ending discussions about whether corals will grow better at an alkalinity of 7 or 11. But quite frankly, when it comes to growing corals, you don't need to know your alkalinity from your elbow. I've been keeping reef tanks for 8 years now, and despite alkalinity being one of the most important parameters in a reef tank, I still couldn't tell you what the scientific definition is. It has something to do with the interaction of various ions in saltwater, but all you really need to know is that alkalinity comes in a bottle, and you need to add a little more as your corals deplete the levels in your tank, which you can establish by carrying out a 60-second alkalinity test. Number 4 is that nutrient levels control algae. If you ask on Facebook why you have algae problems, someone will probably tell you it's because your phosphate isn't at 0.03 parts per million and your nitrate isn't at 5 parts per million. And while it's true to say that high phosphate levels can lead to algae outbreaks, that is only a small part of the story. This tank, for example, has had phosphate levels 10 times higher than that for years, and yet you won't find any undesirable algae. It's not nutrient levels that keep this tank free from the green stuff, it's the many vegetarian fish and inverts I have, as well as the large amount of filtration that exports any nutrients my corals don't use. Getting a rough balance of nutrient levels is important, but it's outdated to simply see nitrate and phosphate as tools for algae control. And the only thing that concerns me about nitrate and phosphate is when the levels drop to 0. If that happens, corals will struggle and undesirable pests can take hold. And for many tanks, chasing numbers for nitrate and phosphate will do more harm than simply letting the tank find its groove. The penultimate saltwater myth I want to bust today is that you need a protein skimmer. And this is another myth that's based on an element of truth. Skimmers are a fantastic filter to have as they remove CO2, which effectively oxygenates your water, and of course they remove grubby fish poo. But you can achieve most of the benefits of a skimmer with simple, cheaper alternatives. On my nano tank, the fish poo is taken care of with weekly water changes and a disposable filter sponge, and the power heads provide ample water movement and therefore oxygenation. And it's not just nano tanks that don't need skimmers. This 1000 litre 250 gallon tank runs on simple canister filters and regular water changes, and yet it looks absolutely fantastic. The corals are healthy, happy and grown out, and there's no sign of nuisance algae despite the phosphate levels sitting off the charts at 0.6, which also reinforces my previous point. So while skimmers are undeniably a great option for many, next time someone tells you they're essential, show them this tank. And the number one myth about saltwater tanks is that they are all expensive. And again, there is of course some truth to this. I spent almost £4,000 simply on the starting equipment for this tank, and you could easily spend double that without breaking a sweat. But the truth is that spending more money on fancy equipment won't make you any more successful than buying the right budget equipment. And corals will appreciate a cheap T5 light just as much, if not more, than they will a £500 LED light with Bluetooth and Wi-Fi control. And you simply don't need to spend four figures setting up a saltwater tank. I set up this 25 gallon 100 litre tank for just £182 using brand new equipment from trusted manufacturers. And if you've got an eye for a bargain, you can dip into the second hand market and go much bigger for not much more cash. Now, reef tanks can often seem just about the money, but the one thing all great reef tanks have in common isn't the expensive equipment in the sump, it's the diligent hobbyist behind the tank.